Back. Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. This video we're going to talk about practicing low light techniques with the handgun. Now, there's nothing tactical, or if you like the word tactical, about low light when it comes to self-defense. We have headlights on our cars, street lights on our streets, lamps in our homes. We put light everywhere, sometimes needlessly so. I've seen some cars that they believe that they needed to illuminate the ground underneath them even though they couldn't see it because they drive the car from the inside. But that's beside the point. Fact of the matter is, we like light. We created light, we invented light because we got tired of losing so much productivity to the darkness. And not only that, we like to be able to push back the night because us being diurnal by nature, we have this sometimes primal fear of things that we can't see, which is why we created light to begin with. So we've already come full circle. When it comes to self-defense, bad things don't just happen during the day. They can happen at night, or they can happen during the day inside of a place where the natural lighting provided from Bob, the big orange ball, isn't sufficient enough for us to actually be able to see and accurately figure out exactly what's going on. Our eyes just don't perform very well as light is removed from the situation. And that doesn't just mean the sun setting or whatever. It could be as simple as the fact that the environment you're in is momentarily or permanently dim or dark. Now, common sense kind of tells us that if our bad guy doesn't have a flashlight, or if our bad guy doesn't have a lighting source and he can't see us, then he's probably not going to attempt to attack us. And this is absolutely true. However, dim light and darkness are two totally different things. And while an adversary, a criminal, whatever you want to call him, can function pretty well in dim light because they don't have to play by the rules, we have to know what we're dealing with. And beside that, the light itself acts as a very strong deterrent, which I've mentioned in the past. I like having the light in my hand anytime I'm in an environment where I might need the light. And it's not because I'm always like, conditioned red or whatever you want to call it. It's the fact that I like to be able to see things. And this little thing at night allows me to do that. It's like the same principle of when I drive my car, I like to have my headlights on. I like the ability to have light on demand in my hand, to be able to illuminate a dark alley underneath a stairwell, underneath a car, underneath a truck, through a parking lot, something like that, or act as a deterrence if I make contact with someone who just gives me that gut feeling of this person is contextually out of place, or the words that are coming out of their mouth don't necessarily match their physical manifestations of what they're doing with themselves. Could be a crazy person in a parking lot, could be an unknown individual in a park, who knows? Bottom line, I have the light, it's in my hand, it's ready to go. It's not a big deal. I see some people carry around their keys in like this crazy punch method, and that's okay, but sometimes when you talk to people about just having the light in your hand ready to go in case you need it, they look at you like you're crazy, which I don't really understand, but kind of beside the point. As a deterrent, light's great. When it comes time to use the firearm, if the light's deterrence fails, or if you just didn't have it out in time, if you didn't have it out at all, then you have to be able to control the handgun and the handheld light at the same time if you choose not to use a weapon-mounted light, which we'll get to. Kind of like the topics of categories, there's three kind of methods of operation when it comes to low-light shooting with the handgun. There's no light, which I don't advise absolutely whatsoever. Just go ahead and stop that if you're doing it already, and don't be one of those people who say, well, I never go out at night. Power goes out, sometimes you're out during the day in a place where light could be beneficial. I've never met someone who needed light as a deterrence or to shoot in light or in darkness and we're like, man, you know what? I just really wish I didn't have that light with me. Or I really wish I didn't have that bright of a light. Those are things that I haven't heard. Doesn't mean that person doesn't exist. I just haven't met them. So we'll just go ahead and, for the sake of discussion, ignore the fact that there are people who carry firearms and don't carry any source of light whatsoever. Because as far as I'm concerned, that's foolish. Next up, we have handheld only, which pretty good. Handheld, I consider to be a mandatory, basically. You should have a handheld light. Should. Then we have handheld with an additional device such as the Theorem, which is my personal favorite for handheld lights, even if I'm carrying a weapon light, and we'll get to that. And then, of course, we have handheld light in conjunction with a weapon-mounted light. So we need to be able to practice those techniques, but most people are not going to have access to a place where they can shoot at night, and I totally understand that. Situations be what they are, you live in an urban area, you live in a rural area, but you still can't shoot at night, or you have a range where you can do whatever you want except until the sun goes down. So I totally get it. which is why sometimes we have to practice these basic techniques under dry fire or on the range during the day. There's nothing wrong with practicing your handheld light techniques or weapon-mounted light techniques in the daylight. There are some drawbacks to it because when you do practice them under low light conditions, you immediately know when you're doing something wrong based on what the light is or isn't doing for you. But you can still practice the techniques and the manipulations of the firearm without necessarily having to have access to a place where you can shoot in low light. It just takes a little bit of dedication and getting away from your comfort zone. Another thing to keep in mind is depending on what your default light carry is, if you only carry a handheld, you should definitely be spending a lot of time on your one-handed shooting. Now we'll get into them, there are some grip techniques you can use with just a handheld light and the handgun, but they're not going to provide you with the stability that you're used to from your traditional two-handed grip, and because of that your accuracy is going to suffer, contextually speaking, relative to distance and how many rounds you're firing and so on and so forth. You can consciously slow your rate of fire to kind of bring that thing back together, and that's something that you're going to have to experience for yourself. But if you don't spend a lot of time practicing your primary hand only shooting, I say use both hands independently of each other, primary hand and support hand, wounded drills and so on, and those techniques. But in conjunction with the handheld light, depending on what technique you choose to use or what you're forced to use, one-handed shooting is definitely going to come in handy. Now beyond that, we talk about just the manipulation of the light itself. What technique should I use with my handgun to hold the light? My answer to that has always been the same. Have a technique for each side of the body. Reason being, if I'm using a piece of cover, and let's say the cover exposes to the right, like I'm behind that left side of the door, left side of the wall, whatever. I've got my handgun, I can easily use my neck index or my FBI technique and still be able to get around and use my handgun. Now, if I were to be using a Harry's in that situation, I would have to lean out further in order to engage the light, and that's going to be problematic. So I've got my right side technique, and then if I encounter a left-sided cover, I can then use a modified Harry's or whatever my technique's going to be to put the light on either side of the gun based on the situation. And of course, there's just so many different handheld light techniques out there. The most common ones you're going to see are going to be the FBI technique, the neck index technique, the syringe technique, and Harry's technique. And then there's some modifications there of those techniques involved, and that's just talking about a light with no additional thing, like a ring clip or a Theorem Switchback or a device that allows you to better control the body of the light itself. So beyond that, the next thing we have to talk about is actually shooting with the light. And this is where you don't have to have a low light environment to practice it, because it's not going to be the light itself necessarily, although light does play a part in it, but it's not going to be the light itself necessarily that causes your accuracy issues if you're going to have them. It's going to be the compromised nature of how you have to hold the light. If you're going to use FBI or neck index, you're pretty much relegated to one-handed shooting. If you're going to use the syringe method or the Harry's method, you're going to notice that there are some asymmetrical fatigue points, if you will, that are present that weren't there before, and your grip is definitely going to be compromised no matter how many of your little digits you're able to get onto your primary hand when you're holding the gun. You're still going to have the overriding problem of it's not the grip you're used to. So if I'm going to use this syringe technique, I've got some palm contact and maybe a little bit of finger contact here and there, and I'm kind of grubbing around for dear life to get all the contact I can. But it's still not the grip I'm used to. Obviously, Harry's is just back of wrist to back of wrist, so it's going to help me resetting recoil, but it doesn't necessarily add to my grip at all. I'm still using a one-handed grip, and I've got a little bit of ledge support coming from this other hand. These are things that have to be practiced. In daylight situations, just take it to the range and shoot. Pick some reasonable distances. And work your way back as proficiency increases. I like to start off at distances where I would expect to need these techniques. Low light, diminished light environments, less distance of vision. I'm engaged with a person, thinking most likely to least likely. Some kind of conversation may have taken place, so I'm going to base my practice distances off of the most likely situation of I've made some kind of physical contact with this person, and then I'm going to work my way back towards like the spontaneous attacks or defense of a third party or something like that. Conversational distances with an unknown person are a great distance to work with. Everybody kind of has an innate idea of what that distance is going to be, so that's something you can work with. Now, beyond the general light controls, the next thing we need to talk about is actually reloading the firearm. If you're using just handheld light, it does create some problems because you've got something in the hand you're going to use to feed the gun. Now, the chances of you needing to go to a reload in a self-defense shooting, I can't really say because I can't predict the future. It is unlikely, if you look at the shootings that have happened, for the average citizen to actually work through all the ammunition in their gun and go to reload. But if you carry a limited capacity single stack type of gun or a revolver or something like that, it's something that you should be proficient in, not necessarily because you might immediately need the ammo in this emergency gunfight against 15 guys, but if you fired I don't know how many rounds, at some point in the near future it might be a good idea to put that spare magazine or that spare speed loader or moon clip or whatever into the gun to be prepared in the event that you need the firearm again, because an empty gun is a decent hammer and really nothing else at all. Everything in totality, all the possible things that we could have to do with the firearm, we should be as proficient as possible, going from most likely to least likely. But the biggest problem you're going to have with managing the firearm in a reload is the fact that your hand, like I said, is occupied with the flashlight. Now, the technique that you're using doesn't necessarily matter in regards to the reload. And what I mean by that is no matter what technique you're using, unless you're choosing to stick the light in your mouth or stick the light in your pocket or something like that, this hand is going to have a flashlight in it. It's not really that big of a deal for the average person, because the average person has average size hands, flashlight diameters aren't too extreme, and it's something you can practice. I don't carry this way, but I do practice this way because who knows, maybe my weapon light goes down and I'm reduced to using a handheld light, and for some reason I don't have my Theorem Switchback on the light. And of course I have to teach it, so it's something to stay proficient in, even though this is not a way that I would ever carry. I would never carry without a weapon mounted light. The only caveat being when I have to do deep concealment cover with a Glock 26, and I can't think of any reason why I would carry a flashlight without the switchback on it, but we'll get to that. So I'm using my whatever technique I'm choosing to use, and the gun runs out of ammunition. Now I've got a couple options here. One I already talked about. I can stick the light in my mouth, problematic. I can stick the light in my pocket, now I don't have it, and it's going to be harder for me to get back to it. Or I can simply tuck it into the web of my thumb, index my magazine like I normally do. Got to remember to take the other one out first. Insert, release slide, back to work. For you right-handed shooters, that might actually be a little bit easier for you because you've got that thumb actuated release on the handgun. For me, it's not that big of a deal because I practice one-hand manipulations in the firearm so often. The only additional concern I have is making sure I take that flashlight and tuck it into the web of the thumb to free up as much of this space as I have possible, and then indexing the magazine isn't going to be a big deal. Now, my spare magazines are usually +5 or +3, so I've got a little bit more meat to work with, and I also carry a full-size 17. For those of you carrying a Glock 43, I encourage you to add a +2, +3 base pad to it, if not only for extra ammunition, but it also gives you additional manipulation space, and you can probably conceal that additional length of magazine pretty easily. If the magazine itself's body isn't as long as the slide of the gun, or it's shorter than the slide of the gun, you shouldn't have a concealment problem at all. If you carry a 19, shouldn't be an issue. If you carry an M&P compact, shouldn't be an issue. But this is something you have to explore and practice for yourself. This is one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of just the handheld light only. I always add to my flashlights a Theorem Switchback, which I'm about to talk about, because this allows me to get the light almost completely out of the way, so I'm using my traditional reloading technique. Now we get into the Theorem Switchback. What's so great about the Switchback? There's other products like it on the market, but this is the one that I use, so it's the one I'm going to talk about. The Switchback basically allows me to use a light in a traditional ice pick grip, but if I have to draw my firearm, I can then roll the device around, apply pressure with my knuckle or the outside of one of my fingers to the back, and now I can use a more traditional two-handed shooting grip on the firearm. When it comes to manipulating the firearm, my grip is somewhat compromised. There's no getting around that. However, it's easy for me to transition back and forth between a traditional ice pick grip on the light and my two-handed shooting grip. It's not going to be exact, so if you are going to use a Theorem Switchback, you definitely have to practice this because your grip is still compromised a little bit, but it's nowhere nearly as bad as some of the other devices I've used, or, well, the just straight up flashlights with nothing on them whatsoever. Surefire does make a cool little kit of like a syringe and a hook and some other stuff that you can use, and those aren't too bad for Surefire lights, but the Theorem has been my personal favorite because of the ease of manipulation and some other reasons we'll get to next. So the technique is the same every single time, and of course it does take some practice getting used to the fact of, you know, you still have to do your one-handed draw, roll the light around, get the light, make the gun, and get used to your grip. Go to the range, practice it. You don't even have to turn the light on, just practice shooting with the Theorem, applying pressure to the Theorem to activate the light, and see how your accuracy does. And I think you'll find if you're just transitioning to the Theorem, your groups, your consistency, and your ability to shoot faster are going to be better than they were without this or a device like it. When it comes to fixing the gun, be it most likely reloading the ammunition source. Again, let's say for the sake of argument, for some reason you do run out of ammunition in a self-defense shooting. So, you know, I'm using my switchback and I'm aimed in, and oh, I ran out of ammo. Now I can just get the light out of the way, leave it exactly where it is. I can drop that magazine, insert the next magazine, and I can go right back to what I was doing, which is pretty cool. There's not a whole lot of I've got to move the light specifically out of the way. I just kind of let it dangle, perform my reload, and when I do let it dangle, my pressure comes off the rear of it, so the light goes off automatically if that's something that you're worried about. And now I can get the gun up and go right back to work. Practice, 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 practice. I see plenty of people that practice their from concealment draw, slightly less number who practice their from concealment draw with just one hand, and slightly less than that who spend a lot of time practicing their from concealment reloads. At least dedicated, deliberate practice. Practice in lieu of something else isn't necessarily the same thing. Sometimes your inefficiencies and accuracies were caused by the fact that you lost a little bit of speed in your technique because of your reload, and then you rushed your shots after the reload, and that's why you're looking at your target wondering what that little guy is. So if you're, again, getting into deliberate practice, what caused the mistake, focus on that next, and that way you can prevent it in the future. But that's the reason I love the Theorem Switchback, because it's minimally invasive for operating the firearm without a weapon light. Low light classes are great, but we can't take an 8 or a 16-hour class, you know, every couple of months to stay fresh on these skills. And every instructor, every teacher that teaches low light is going to have a slightly different approach to it, so that's something to consider as well. Sometimes you get into a low light class and you get false confidence because it takes place on a range that's completely devoid of all natural light whatsoever, and no natural lighting conditions are presented during the class by the instructor, so you come away with false confidence. And I've been in classes before where I've been in the very middle of the line and there were so many weapon lights on line I didn't even use mine because I didn't need it. All this other light was going down range, I'm like, I'll just use their light. Which isn't necessarily very realistic, and that's something to consider when you are taking low light classes. Is the environment in which you're practicing and training and being taught as realistic as it could be? Because these are, you know, this is a put your hand up time. Like, hey, what about backlighting? Or what about photonic barriers? Or what about situations where my light is saturated by another light? Or there's plenty of considerations. Working inside, you can be like, hey, what about umbrella lighting? What about baseboard lighting? What about reflective surfaces and this and that? There's no real magic to low light. The proper techniques can be taught in a few hours, but it takes years and years and years and years and years to master them. And every time you think you've got it down, some new technology comes along, or you realize maybe you've been doing something incorrectly or at least inefficiently the entire time, and you have to go back to not necessarily square one, but you've got to rethink your approach to the ways that you practice. I wanted to make this video just give you some very basic concepts on how I approach practicing my weapon-mounted light, low light, handheld light techniques for shooting with a handgun. Because it's something that you can practice during the day if you choose to. You don't necessarily need the light. Although, if you have access to a range where you can shoot at night, I encourage you to practice there instead, because that has the added benefit not only of shooting in the conditions that you're practicing to shoot in, but the light will let you know when you're doing things wrong a lot quicker in those actual conditions, and you're going to be able to see it on the range, because in the range you've got the sun, and man does not produce a handheld flashlight yet that really outpowers the sun. If you're close enough, you can kind of see the light reflecting off the target, and that's fine. That gives you an idea of, okay, my hot spot's in the right place, but it's still not the same. If you are able to practice under low light conditions, even under dry fire conditions, introduce natural lighting. A hall light is still on, or you've got some cutting light from the side from 2 car headlights or a street lamp, and you've got to push your light through the street light into the darkness beyond it. Things like that. Think about those natural lighting conditions that you encounter daily and nightly. And try to replicate those on the range if you're able. If you're not, work them in dry fire. Get a SIRT pistol, go upside with your Mark 1 finger gun, and work that way. It may look a little crazy. Neighbors might call the cops, but, well, it's worth it if you get some good reps out of it. I'm Aaron Count with Sage Dynamics. Training accordingly.